Hi, so ISO and gain, what are they and how are they different? And what does that mean to those of us shooting with our electronic video cameras? Let's start with ISO. So ISO is a sensitivity rating, and if you shoot with film, that would normally be an indication of the actual sensitivity of that film stock. And if we wanted to change how sensitive our film camera was, you'd actually change the roll of film in that camera for a more or less sensitive film and have a more or less sensitive system. But with an electronic camera, most of us can't actually change the sensor in the cameras. So that means we actually have a fixed sensitivity. Now, there are some cameras available today that do have a dual ISO function, and those cameras do have two different sensitivities, and that's done by changing the way the sensor itself fundamentally operates. But that's quite different to what we see in most cameras that have a gain switch or a menu setting where you can change the ISO rating of the camera in relatively small steps. What's happening there in those cameras when you change that ISO number is you're changing the amount of gain that's applied in the camera. And the problem that we have is that ISO doesn't actually tell us what the camera is doing. It does give you a number that you can put into a light meter to get the right exposure or the right brightness of image, but that's not the same as changing the sensitivity of the camera. If instead we use dB of gain in our cameras, it does actually tell us much more about what the camera is doing, because when you are at 0 dB, you don't have any added gain, and this is normally where most cameras will deliver the best dynamic range, the lowest noise, and the best image overall. When you add in 6 dB of gain, you are doubling the gain in the camera, and this will generally double the noise, and it will also typically reduce the dynamic range by around 1 stop. And for each 6 dB of gain that you add, the same could be said. So when you get to 12 dB of gain, you will have 2 times 2, that's 4 times the noise, and less dynamic range. And when you get to 18 dB of gain, you'll have 2 times 2 times 2, because that's 3 lots of 6 in 18, and you'll have 8 times as much noise. So when you use dB, you know what the camera is doing, and you can take pretty much any camera from any manufacturer and know that at 0 dB that camera will perform at its best, and at 12 dB it's going to be pretty noisy. Now with ISO, we don't know that. We don't know what the ISO rating of that camera means in terms of noise or grain. It tells us nothing about that. And another problem that we have is that different gamma curves in a camera produce different brightness of images. So different gamma curves may have different ISO ratings, even when they're at 0 dB of gain. And we see that a lot in many cameras, and it causes a huge amount of confusion. Because somebody will say, well, this camera is rated at, let's say, 2000 ISO at its base, and then you go to a different gamma curve, and actually the correct base rating becomes 800, just because of the differences between the gamma curves, and not because there's more or less gain, and not because the camera's become more or less sensitive. The sensitivity is actually the same. It is just an exposure rating. So overall, with an electronic camera, my recommendation to you is to actually use dB of gain instead of ISO. You'll find it a lot less confusing. When you are at 0 dB, you're going to get the very best performance out of that camera. When you're at 18 dB, it's going to be noisy, it's going to be grainy, and it applies for every single camera that you're ever likely to use. Sure, I get it, ISO sounds cool, it's more like working with film, but then we have to be a little bit honest with ourselves here, and actually how many of us are actually using light meters to set our exposure on a day-to-day basis? I'm sure some of you are, but the majority are probably not. So using ISO doesn't give you any benefit at all. All it does is add a layer of possible confusion.